Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Teardown. Today we're going to be tearing down the Endgame Gear XM2w 4K V2. Now this mouse, as I talked about in my full review, is actually a surprisingly decent mouse from Endgame Gear. It's not as good as the OP1AK, unfortunately, due to some design issues, specifically the non-indented main clicks here and the odd side button implementation, on top of the rather small scroll wheel. But to their credit, the shape is actually great, being this very wide symmetrical shaping with this aggressive tapering at the mid region, which is without a doubt the most comfortable symmetrical mouse I've used to date, specifically for my larger hands. However, compared to the OP1 series, this mouse does fall a little short, unfortunately, and that also continues when it comes to the mouse's repairability. As well, it is an Endgame Gear product and is somewhat serviceable. The internal components are not as modular as they were in the OP1 series, meaning the mouse's serviceability isn't on the same fantastic degree as their other products. But regardless, I still wanted to make a teardown guide to show you guys how to fully disassemble and reassemble the mouse, talk about the mouse's internal design, modding options, and more. But before we get into it, as always, you will need a couple tools. Firstly, having a precision screwdriver set and a repair kit, something like this iFixit kit I have here, will be very beneficial. Now thankfully, all the screws inside the XM2 are Phillips heads, so you only need one size bit to take the mouse apart, but having things such as a pair of tweezers or some pry tools may make the disassembly process a little easier. And next, you also need some kind of mat to do your teardown on. Now, I like to use this silicone soldering mat as it is anti-static and has built-in screw and component storage, but you can use pretty much whatever you want. Just make sure whatever you do use doesn't generate any kind of static electricity and has some way for you to track all the mouse's various components and screws. Alright, and once you've got all your tools together, you're ready to go ahead and start your teardown process. Let's go ahead and tear down the Endgame Gear XM2w 4K V2. Alright, starting off, first thing you're going to do is you want to take the mouse, flip it over, and you will need to remove the mouse's stock skates, either the pre-installed half-size one or the full-size skates, as unfortunately, unlike the OP1 series, the mouse's stock skates do cover the base access screws, which is disappointing to see, and hopefully this is something we see addressed on future versions of the XM2 series, as having to remove the stock skates to service the mouse is quite disappointing. And also, the process of removing the stock skates can be a little tricky since there are no skate removal ramps on the mouse's base, which is another thing I hope is added in a future iteration, but thankfully due to the new skates adhesive process, they are easy to remove, though you'll need a pry tool like this or a flathead screwdriver to get them out on the corner, but regardless they are relatively easy to remove, and once done so you can take a PH0 or a PH000 screwdriver bit. I'm going to go ahead and grab the PH0 bit here, and we can go ahead and remove 4 base access screws that are located here, 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 and here. Once those base access screws are disconnected, go ahead and make a pincher with your fingers and put pressure on the widest edges of the rear hump here, and with enough pressure the back of the shell will open up, wide enough for you to take a pry tool, click it into the side of the shell, and run it along the sides here to disconnect the clamps. And with that done, the top shell will disconnect from the base shell just like this. But as you can see, there are several components attached via JST connectors here that we will have to disconnect. And we can do so by just taking your fingernails, grabbing the sides of these connectors and gently wiggling upwards. Sometimes it will take a lot of force to disconnect them, but with enough pressure, you can take them off just like that. And with those components disconnected, that is how you disconnect the top and base shells here for the XM2w. Now I'm gonna go ahead and put the base shell off to the side for a moment, and we're gonna go ahead and focus on the top shell first. Alright, now for the top shell, there are several components here that can be removed, most notably this very unique mechanism for the scroll wheel click here, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But to start off, we're going to go ahead by removing the side button PCB, and we're going to swap back to our smaller PH000 bit for this, and we can remove this PCB by removing a screw from here and a screw from here. Alright, once that's disconnected, just like it was on the OP1AK, this PCB can be a little tricky to remove here. So what I recommend doing is taking your screwdriver and just pushing under and pulling up on the sides of the PCB like this to disconnect it. You can also use a pry tool or something else, but with a little bit of prying, you can remove the side button PCB in one solid piece. And here we have those full-size solder switches and the JST connector here. Putting the side button PCB off to the side for a moment. Next, we can go ahead and remove the side buttons themselves, which is quite easy to do so, as all you do is flip the shell over, push the buttons into the shell, and then you want to just gently lift up on these little corners here to pop the side buttons out in one solid piece, which we will also put off to the side. Next, we can go ahead and remove the main clicks by removing a screw from here, 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 and here. Alright, and then with those screws removed, we can now take a finger and just gently pull up on the back of the clicks to disconnect them, and they will just fall out of the shell relatively easily. And then here we have both of our main clicks, which we will also put off to the side. Moving back to the top shell here, the last component we have is this very unique scroll wheel click mechanism here, which, as I talked about in the full review, when you click the wheel click down, this entire structure moves down like this, and the small little tip of this piece here activates this switch on the main PCB. Now, this is definitely a very unique way of implementing a wheel click, one that I actually don't mind here given the smaller forward region here, but as I talked about in my full review, this switch type is very heavy, which makes the wheel click incredibly heavy, and on a future version I'd like to see a lighter switch here, as a scroll wheel is definitely a little too heavy in my opinion. Another thing I wanted to note about this mechanism here is that, as you can see towards the top, this is anchored into the top shell via a kind of hinge system here. Now, these do appear to be slightly pre-lubed here, but over the lifespan of the mouse, if this lubing does fail, this will cause issues, as the plastic rubbing against the plastic will of course increase the actuation weight here, meaning that over the lifespan of the mouse, I would recommend re-lubing these switches once in a while just to ensure the wheel click is functional. And you can remove this structure from the top shell by pushing it all the way up like this, and then grabbing it and just gently pulling up and out of the shell like that. Just be really careful when you do this, because you are putting direct pressure on the encoder, so just be mindful of that. And if over the lifespan of the mouse the encoder does fail, even though this is a more durable encoder type than what was used on the previous versions of the XM2, it is modular due to its JST connector here, meaning this entire component can be replaced very easily. Alright, and then with that removed, that is everything for the top shell disassembly here for the XM2w 4K V2. Overall, the disassembly here is a relatively easy process. The only tricky part to this is, of course, this wheel click component here, but the only time you'll ever have to remove this is if you have to replace the encoder, so I wouldn't really worry about that aspect of it. Alright, but with everything removed from the top shell, we'll go ahead and put that off to the side, and now we can go ahead and disassemble the base shell. Alright, now the base shell here is going to be a fairly easy disassembly process, as there really isn't too much to remove here, and we can start off by disconnecting the mouse's battery by doing the same process as we did earlier with the other JST connectors, just gently wiggling it up until it disconnects, and there is the battery's 3mm JST PH connector there. Next, we can go ahead and put this back down, and we're going to go ahead and remove 3 screws from the base here. There's one located here, here, and here. With those screws removed, we can now go ahead and remove this structure that is holding the battery in place, but it's worth noting these plastic pegs that anchor onto the pilot holes here are very strongly attached, and you might need to take a pry tool and kind of wiggle underneath this plastic to disconnect it, because they can be rather firmly installed. But after a little bit of fidgeting with them, you should be able to remove them relatively easily. And here is the central cage structure that holds the battery in place. Now, as you can see here, the battery is just held in by a small piece of adhesive, meaning it is removable. So if you want to mod out this 335 mAh battery, you can do so, but keep in mind that due to this cage's position on the PCB, if you alter the battery's weight or size, it will affect both the mouse's X-axis balancing and its Y-axis balancing, as it's positioned a little more rightward in the shell than we commonly see, as most mice have their batteries like this. So keep the odd battery position in mind here if you plan on modding the XM2's battery. Now, putting the base shell off to the side for a moment, we can of course remove the battery, and we can do so by just gently pressing on the bottom of the battery. You can use a pry tool for this so it makes this a little easier, but just a little bit of pressure towards the bottom of it just to disconnect its adhesive, and with enough pressure the battery will be removed, meaning again you can mod it out for another one if you want to, but keep the mouse's balancing in mind if you do so. Putting this off to the side and circling back to the main PCB here, now we can go ahead and remove one more anchoring screw, which is located right here. And with that screw removed, we can now remove the PCB by just gently picking it up from the back here, lifting it up, and then pulling it out of the front to remove the whole PCB in one solid piece. Now, notably, this PCB is much larger than the one found in both the OP1AK V1 and V2, which is a little odd considering I expected the PCB to be rather small, but regardless, this is a larger PCB, and hopefully on future iterations we see the size of this PCB cut down to reduce the mouse's overall weight a little bit. Lastly, we have a small little slider button in the base here, which corresponds to the on and off switch right here, which will most likely come out with the PCB when it's removed from the base shell here, and we'll put this off to the side and talk more about that in a moment. Alright, and with that, that is everything removed from the base shell here, the XM2. A very straightforward process as expected for most base shells. Now we'll put this off to the side for now. I'm going to go ahead and grab our main PCB, our battery, the unique scroll wheel mechanism, and of course the side buttons, and let's talk about the mouse's PCB layout and specs next. Starting off with the side button PCB, here we'll find two full-size Shell XM2w mechanical switches, the same ones that Endgame Gear has used on many of their other mice, which are decently implemented here. And as I talked about earlier, this component is modular as it connects to the main PCB via a 4-pin JST connector, and since these are full-size switches and they are soldered here, this component is moddable, so if you want to mod out these switches for other types or replace this component as a whole, you can do so rather easily. Moving on to our scroll wheel, here we'll find a Shell dust-proof 24-step mechanical encoder, which is a 5mm variant. Now you can actually remove the encoder from the structure by pulling back this little clip towards the top here and pushing out from the bottom. However, the process of getting everything back into this piece here is rather difficult, so I'm going to leave it intact for this teardown here. But you can replace the encoder relatively easily. It's just a little tricky to get everything back in here. And as I talked about earlier, this component is also modular as it connects to the main PCB via a 3-pin JST connector here, meaning replacing the encoder is very easy here, which is a nice improvement coming from the OP18K series where the encoders were always soldered to the main PCB. Moving on to the battery, here we have a larger 335 mAh battery which also uses a 3-pin JST PH connector. Now as I talked about in my full review, the run times on this mouse aren't ideal despite the larger battery size here, but the battery is serviceable and moddable. But again, keep in mind, as I talked about earlier, due to the battery's unique positioning as it's positioned off to the side here, if the battery is modded for a larger or a smaller one, it will affect the mouse's overall x-axis balancing and the y-axis balancing, so keep that in mind. And lastly, moving on to the main PCB, here we have two Shell GX SPDT switches, the same switches we found on many of Endgame Gear's recent releases, which are very well implemented and have great performance, but unlike the OP1 series, they are soldered to the main board. They are not hot swap, which is disappointing to see, and hopefully on a future version of the XM2 we see modular switches like we saw in the OP1 series, as that would be a great improvement here. Moving on to the scroll wheel click, as I talked about earlier, here we have another Shell XM2w mechanical switch, the same switch type that was used for the side buttons, which unfortunately due to its higher actuation weight is rather poorly implemented here as the wheel is very heavy in conjunction with this unique scroll wheel click structure here, and hopefully on a future version of the XM2 we see a lighter switch used. Moving on to the antenna, instead of a traced or inlaid antennas as we commonly see used, here we actually have a ceramic antenna, which is a really nice attention to detail, as this antenna type offers several advantages over traditional antenna implementations, but if you want to learn more about this, you can check out the full review. Moving on to the mouse's sensor, here we have a custom PAW 3950 developed in collaboration with Pixar, specifically the 3950U+1F95A, which is Endgame Gear's most recent collaboration with Pixar, and it is actually a very well implemented sensor with a lot of cool features inside of it, specifically the fact that a lot of the power saving features that are commonly found on the sensor have been removed here, hence why the mouse's battery life is rather low, but if you want to learn more about this, you can check out the full review. And lastly for MCU, here we have a Nordic 52 series SoC, specifically the 52840, which is a very common MCU type for the time that this mouse was released at. Admittedly, I would have loved to see a 54 series SoC here to improve the mouse's run times, but to Endgame Gear's credit, the implementation of this MCU is actually really good here, so I don't mind it too much, though again, I would have loved to see longer run times on the mouse, and hopefully we'll see improvements to this on the next version of the XM2. Alright, that's everything for the mouse's PCB layouts and specs. We'll go ahead and put this back off to the side for a moment, and now we can go ahead and talk about the mouse's individual component weights. Now, as a preface to this segment, Endgame Gear is advertising that the XM2w 4K V2 will weigh approximately 61.5 grams in its stock configuration, but as always there will be some variance to this, as the mouse's base weight with no skates is 58.76 grams, or in its base configuration the mouse weighs 60.35 grams, and when using the extra full-size skates the mouse's weight increases to 61.83 grams. Starting off, we'll start with the top shell with everything removed from it, and it collectively weighs 16.15 grams. The main clicks collectively weigh 5.79 grams. The side buttons weigh a gram on the dot. The base shell with its slider button weighs around 11.43 grams. The cage for the mouse's battery weighs a gram as well. The mouse's 335 mAh battery weighs 7.22 grams, which is definitely on the higher end for a battery of this capacity, and hopefully in the future we can see Endgame Gear reduce the mouse's battery weight by a little bit. Ideally around the 5 or 4 grams would be perfect. Next, the entire scroll wheel structure weighs 3.23 grams. The side button PCB and its switches weighs around 2.06 grams. And the main PCB weighs around 9.46 grams, which is definitely on the heavier side compared to Endgame Gear's other mice's main PCBs, but hopefully on a future version of the XM2, this PCB will be reworked so it's a little smaller and lighter. And lastly, all the screws inside the XM2 collectively weigh 1.38 grams. Alrighty. That wraps up our segments on the individual component weights here for the XM2. Now we can go ahead and start our reassembly process, and we're going to start off with the base shell here. Alright, starting off, firstly we're going to go ahead and reinstall this base slider button here, which is very easy to install as it just slides into the bottom part of the shell just like that, and you can verify it's installed properly by flipping the shell over and make sure this actuates. But as a quick note here, the positioning of this is extremely important as on the underside of the PCB there is a corresponding slider switch as well, meaning you need to be extremely careful when reorienting the PCB into the base shell, as if this is misaligned with this button, you could potentially break this slider switch, which will render your mouse inoperable. So be very careful with this and make sure to orient this in the top or bottommost position. I'm going to do the bottommost one, and make sure this base button is in the corresponding position. Once everything is aligned, you can go ahead and take the main PCB, slide it into the top of the shell here, and just gently drop it into place using these thicker pilot holes as guides of sorts. And then with your finger on top to hold the board in place, flip the mouse over and verify this switch works properly, which it does in our case, so we're good there. We'll flip the mouse back over again, and now we can go ahead and re-anchor the anchoring screw right here. Once the main PCB is anchored into place, go ahead and flip the shell over and just double check both the buttons to make sure nothing changed when you re-anchored the screw. But as long as both these buttons are in place and functional, you are good to go ahead to the next step, which will be handling this central cage structure here. Now we will of course need to reinstall the battery, which is quite easy to do as it just rests in the middle here. So we can just kind of orient it into the center just like that to press it back into place. Next we can go ahead and take the ends of this structure and install them over their pilot holes that are here, here, and here. But it's worth noting, due to the tensioning of them, as they were very hard to remove, they can be kind of hard to reinstall. So what I would recommend doing is lining them up over top as best as you can, kind of get them into place, and then take the flat end of a screwdriver and press them down to clip them on. Like that. Might be a little harder to do with this front one because there's not a lot of real estate, but you can click it in like that, and you can verify it's installed properly as this piece of plastic will be roughly flush with their pilot holes as they are there, there, and there. And once this is installed, we can now go ahead and re-anchor the 3 screws that anchor this end of the PCB to the base shell, one of which goes here, the other here, and the other here. Alright, and then once that is installed, we can go ahead and reconnect the mouse's battery by just taking the end of this JST connector, aligning it with its plug, taking 2 fingers, and clipping it down into place just like that. Alright, now once everything is reinstalled in the base shell here, take your mouse, put it on a flat surface, and make sure there's no wobble to the base. Sometimes in some rare cases, if these screws are over tensioned, it can cause a little bit of base wobble, but this is very rare, and as long as you don't over tension the screws, this shouldn't be a problem. But just double check for this and make sure everything is okay. Also, while you're checking things, I'd recommend flipping the mouse over, turning the mouse on, make sure this indicator LED turns on, connect it to your computer, and just quickly test the mouse's functions. So just check to make sure the sensor is working, there's no tracking related issues. Alright, once you've verified everything is functional here, that is everything for the base shell, the XM2. We'll put that off to the side, and now we'll go ahead and reassemble the top shell. Alright, now the reassembly process for the top shell here is going to be fairly straightforward. The trickiest part we're going to have to deal with though is this wheel click mechanism here, but despite its complicated design here, it is actually relatively easy to reinstall. Angle it into the shell with the left side first, and then clip in the right shell, just like that, to clip it into place. Just make sure when you do this not to put pressure on the wheel itself, only put pressure on the plastic cage. But with that little trick, you can reinstall it quite easily, and again, I would recommend re-lubing these little pegs once in a while just to make sure it's consistent working. Once that's reinstalled, we can now go ahead and reinstall the main clicks themselves, which are very easy to do, as all we have to do is take this hollow structure in the middle here, we'll put the click in through the bottom, and that hollow structure corresponds to this little peg right here. So put the click in through the bottom of the shell, up through the top, orient it as best as you can at the top there. Sometimes it can be a little finicky with the button's design. Clip it over like that. Press it down with your thumb to anchor it into place. We'll do the same thing with the next click, so in through the bottom, up and over, click it in, clip it down just like that. Now once that's done, make sure you firmly press these buttons into place to make sure they're properly installed, and then you can go ahead and re-anchor the main clicks. However, there are two things to note when doing this. Firstly, as I've talked about many times here on the channel, the screws for the main clicks are very delicate, as if they're over tensioned it could ruin the tensioning of the main buttons, rendering them inoperable or making them extremely heavy. So be extremely careful when you re-anchor these 4 anchoring screws, and only screw them in so you feel a little bit of feedback. Do not over tension them under any circumstances. Secondly, due to the button's longer design, if pressure is put on top of the buttons, as you can see here, it can actually dislodge them from their standoffs in the base shell. So when you re-anchor these screws, make sure to rest the shell on its rear hump like this, and then put the screws in at an angle to make sure you're not pushing the clicks off of their standoffs. But with those two things in mind, you can now go ahead and re-anchor the 4 anchoring screws. One goes here, 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 and here. Once the anchoring screws are reinstalled, go ahead and flip the shell over, and you want to test the tensioning of the main clicks. So they should have a natural buoyancy, and they should look roughly like that. If your clicks are sitting lower in the shell and they feel very slow to rebound, you've most likely under tensioned their anchoring screws. And if they're stuck up really high and they have a very high actuation weight, you've most likely over tensioned the screws. So before you continue, take a moment to check your clicks and make sure they're properly tensioned, and feel free to adjust these screws as needed. If the alignment of the buttons is off by a little bit, don't worry about that. They will be aligned properly once they're in the shells. They'll be poked up like that. Sometimes they can sit a little lower or a little higher depending on the tensioning here, but don't worry about that, as once they're in the shell they will sit even, as they'll be supported by the main click switches here. With the main clicks reinstalled, next we can go ahead and install the side buttons themselves, which is quite easy, as all we do is take the ends of the side button structure here and clip it onto the little holes here and here. So just kind of guide it into place like that, clip it in from the top to anchor them into place, and you can verify they're installed properly, as you can just press them on the side to make sure they're actuating properly. With the side buttons reinstalled, next we can go ahead and reinstall the side button PCB itself, which is relatively easy to do, as all you do is take the edges of the PCB itself and you want to orient them into the tiny little slits here and here. I'd recommend starting with the first one, as that seems to be the easiest a lot of the time, but you want to line it up roughly like that, and then you can just take a fingernail or a tool to press them all the way down into place just like that. And you want to make sure the PCB is sitting inside. You don't want it to be sitting above those little standoffs there. And you can verify they're installed properly by checking the side buttons function. And if both of your switches are properly functional, you can next go ahead and reinstall the 2 anchoring screws for the PCB. Alright, and then once that's reinstalled, just double check your side buttons are still functional, which they are on my unit, so we are good to go. And with that, that is everything for the top shell's reassembly here for the XM2. Let's go ahead and grab our base shell, and next we'll go ahead and reassemble the unit and wrap up our teardown. Alright, now the process of re-anchoring the top shell to the base shell is actually quite easy here, as all we need to reconnect is, of course, these JST connectors. Now the easiest way to do this is to kind of orient the shells into each other, kind of like this, and then you can take the JST connectors and just gently reinstall them, just as we did with the battery. Just like that. And then what you can do is you can take the shells and just kind of line them up with each other as best as you can, and then just take your palm, press down to anchor the 2 shells together, just like that. Now before you go ahead and put the base access screws in, I'd recommend turning the mouse on and verifying all the mouse's functions. So test the scroll wheel, test the scroll wheel's click, check the side buttons, check the main clicks, make sure everything is working. If for whatever reason the side buttons and the scroll wheel are not working, it's most likely an issue with the JST connectors, as they're probably not installed all the way. So just open up the shell again, take a pry tool, run along the side as needed, and re-anchor these JST connectors if needed. But after you checked all the mouse's functionality, go ahead and turn it off. We're going to go ahead and swap back to our PH0 bit, the larger Phillips heads bit here, and we can reinstall the 4 base access screws that go here, 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 and here. With the base access screws installed, just take your thumb and run it along the side of the mouse's shell to make sure everything made proper contact. Feel free to give these screws another tension if necessary. And once you've verified everything is functional, you can go ahead and reinstall your preferred set of aftermarket skates here on the mouse's base, or the extra included stock ones. And that concludes today's episode of Teardown. Overall, the XM2 does maintain some serviceability, which is nice to see, but as I mentioned at the top of the video, the mouse isn't anywhere near as serviceable as the OP1AK series is, and when compared to that mouse, there are a lot of aspects of the XM2 that feel a little half-baked in terms of their implementation, specifically the main clicks and the side buttons and the scroll wheel, unfortunately, which does take away from the mouse's fantastic shape. And while I do really like the shape as it's a fantastic size for larger hands, unfortunately due to the non-indented main click specifically, I can't really main this mouse as I have a lot of click interference issues because of their non-indented nature. And aside from those aforementioned issues, there are a lot of other areas this mouse could be improved on, especially when it comes to its weight and its overall design. But hopefully in the future, Endgame Gear can give the same treatment to the XM2 series that they gave to the OP1 series, as the OP1AK V2 is essentially perfect, and hopefully that will apply to the next iteration of the XM2 series, but we'll have to wait and see what Endgame Gear has planned for it. But with that, that concludes today's episode of Teardown. Thank you very much for watching, and thanks again to Endgame Gear for sending the XM2w 4K V2 over for a review. If you want to learn more about this mouse, including its pros and cons, you can check out my full review if you haven't already, which will be linked at the end of this video. And a massive thank you to all of our channel members who make videos like this possible. If you enjoy the content and want to see more teardowns or in-depth reviews or guides, consider subscribing and leaving a like on this video. And if you want to directly support my efforts making repair guides for all mice I cover here on the channel, consider becoming a channel member, as that is the best way to directly support everything I do here on the channel, and being a channel member gives you early access to all upcoming videos, including videos like this one. But with that, that's everything for today's episode of Teardown. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next video. Peace.